All right, this is the last lecture for Unit 1, Unit 1.11. This is on ecology. We'll be looking at a couple of main ideas in ecology. So first, looking at the hierarchy of ecology, the base level for ecology is just the individual organism and how an organism behaves, and ecology is very important. Organisms typically have two things that are associated with them. One of those is their niche. A niche is basically their role in the environment. Here's a picture of some birds that inhabit specific areas of the tree because one of their role is to eat off the ground. The other role is to eat off the mid portion of the tree. You get the idea. This could be broader, things like predator prey, herbivore, carnivore. But a niche is a specific role in an environment that an organism plays for the broader community, versus a habitat, which is just simply where an organism lives. It can be a large range, like this bear here would live in a pretty wide range, but typically lives in a certain kind of habitat. You're not going to find bears in tropical rainforests unless they've been dropped off there, or it's a specific kind of bear that does live in the rainforest. And populations are where you have a group of the same species. So whereas this is an individual narwhal, a group of narwhals is called a population. And a population can be usually in a particular area. So not all the narwhals in the world are not a population, but narwhals that live in a certain group. Like this picture may represent a group of narwhals. A couple terms associated with this is the term Deme. These are geographically disjunct populations. So you have, think of a big area. So go back to the bear picture. You may have a certain part where the bears live, but then over time, you're going to have these little groups of bears kind of break off and represent their own separate little mating areas. You have a source where all of those bears came from, and then you may have certain populations that are less stable than others. This sink Deme is an example of a population that is less stable than the other populations. A community is when you have multiple populations living together. And so here you see the wildebeest and the lion, and there's probably something else in there that's an animal, but even the grass and the trees and the bacteria and everything that lives in would be part of the community. Usually you see a community represented with something called a food web, which you're probably familiar with food webs. And then you have ecosystems, which ecosystems not only consist of the living things, but also the non-living things. And so there's some pictures of non-living things in this picture, like that dead tree and that water and the sun. And I'm sure that there's some rocks in there too. People love to talk about rocks being non-living. And then, the resources that animals need also, even down to the nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and those sorts of things that animals need to live. All right, another branch of ecology is called demography. Demography is just the study of how populations grow and how they decline. You've probably heard the term population demographics, same sort of thing. When you study demography, you typically break things into cohorts, and a cohort is just a group of individuals that are born at the same time. Sometimes you'll see cohorts based on other things like interest groups or those sorts of things, but even then, they're typically broken down into like ages 10 to 19, ages 20 to 29, or whatever. There's some sort of breakdown on the cohorts. Another way to look at organisms, as far as demographic studies is concerned, are these things called population or survivorship curves. Survivorship curves, there's one of three different kinds of survivorship curves. And a survivorship curve essentially shows the percentage of individuals that survive at a particular age. It considers the average lifespan of an organism and how many of those organisms are alive at that lifespan. And so you take a type 1 organism, which we are a great example of a type 1. We have a very high survivability as infants. And so there's still a very high percentage of people that live through infancy and even early adulthood. And you can see how that starts to drop off as we age and get to the general life expectancy of a person. Type 2, what type 2 represents is that organism has an equal chance of survival at any point in their life, or you could say it the opposite way, an equal chance of death. These are typically prey species, but not necessarily. These are species that survival is not dependent upon their age. You think about our own species, a kid is more likely to survive simply because people are caring for them. Whereas in certain animals, that's not necessarily the case. And a type 3 is the other extreme, where you have a lot of infant mortality. So this would be an organism that may lay 10,000 eggs and only 3 of them survive to adulthood, because it's just a different type of survivability. Doesn't make it worse or better. It's just a different way to kind of beat the odds and with natural selection. And so some organisms, trees are a great example of this. They'll produce 2,000 seeds and maybe one of them grows to be an adult oak tree. So you get the idea. A couple different kinds of growth rates. One of them is intrinsic growth, which is a population's ability to grow without any barriers. Another way that we call this is called exponential growth. There's no limits on that population, and so they're able to grow exponentially. Human population is a great example of this. As far as animals, white-tailed deer in this part of the world are growing exponentially right now because, well, they just have great conditions, and there's not a lot of predators in this part of the world for them. Logistic growth is where you have basically more realistic type of growth, where the population will kind of cap at a particular point based on the carrying capacity of that ecosystem. And the carrying capacity is determined on certain limiting factors. Those limiting factors are basically put into 2 groups. You have density dependent factors, which are more biotic type factors like competition, disease. These are factors that are dependent directly upon the density of a population. If it's really dense, it's going to affect it one way. If it's not dense, it'll affect it a completely different way. Whereas density independent factors affect populations equally, independent of their density. These are typically abiotic factors, something like a natural disaster, like this tornado or an earthquake or a volcano or anything like that would be an example of a density independent factor.